I'm Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI and lead of one of the initiatives that were discussed during the fireside chat called SHIFT. And I'm professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm joined by 6 speakers. 5 of them you see here with me on stage, and I will introduce them later to you when they will start their talk. And there is 1 person online. And I hope that we are in connection with this person. So let's keep our fingers crossed. So I don't have to repeat that the accelerated by the preparations and the dialogues towards the Food System Summit 2021, and now with the preparations towards the food system transformation stocktaking, which will take place in Rome in July. But in many countries, although they have identified or developed with multi-stakeholders their food system transformation national action plan, there are still many questions that are coming to us on orange-flesh sweet potato food systems or rice food systems or groundnut food systems. You know, there's a lot of talk about food systems and what is transformation and what are food system innovations or interventions different than value chain interventions, and what should we do different than we did before. And as a consequence, you see that many strategies and so-called game changers that are identified in these national action plans are actually following, you know, the plans that we had in former days. So maybe you can call them, many of them are old wine in new bottles. And we have to find a way to find food system to better outcomes. And as we learned in the first day, better outcomes to ensure that we as human beings survive. So often what you see, the plans are rural oriented, oriented on production and increasing efficiency or increasing production. They are market oriented, increasing with the aim to increase livelihoods and income, to improve diets and to support health.
Back from lunch. I hope we can keep your interest for this session. Great. So as Inga mentioned, my name is Thalia Sparling, and I'm with the Amana team at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And I'm here to speak about homestead food production programs and their impacts on mental health in Bangladesh. I'm presenting on behalf of all my co-authors today that you see here. So by way of context, I will just explain why we started asking questions about the mental health outcomes from nutrition-sensitive interventions. There have been, there's a wide body of literature on the associations between food security and diets and mental health, particularly common mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, and stress. Here we go. And there have also been some interesting analyses which are suggestive that we often see mental well-being outcomes from nutrition-sensitive programs, including nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs. So this is one example of some of that research, and some of the authors are here with us at the ANH Academy. And this is showing effects on that there's a reduced odds of depression from an agroecological intervention that was run in rural Tanzania. And if we do see these effects from these programs and they don't include mental health components explicitly, we wonder what is the mechanism that is leading to these outcomes. And so there have been a couple analyses. This one shows the impact of food security, so changes in food insecurity as a pathway to improving mental health in this population due to the intervention. And we see that there are quite significant reduced odds of depression in this intervention group. So we lead into our question, which is specifically whether an HFP intervention in Bangladesh impacted depressive symptoms, which was mediated. We wanted to look at multiple mediators, including food security and dietary diversity. So we used data from the FARM trial, the Food and Agricultural Approaches to Reducing Malnutrition trial, which was a trial on the on Helen Keller International's Homestead Food Production Program that included components of horticulture, poultry production, and nutrition, as well as food hygiene, and it ran from 2015 to 2019, and we enrolled about 2,600 women of reproductive age in rural northeastern Bangladesh and Sylhet. And what was interesting about this trial was that we had both, as usual, the baseline and endline, but we also had quite a robust rolling surveillance system in both arms of the trial, as well as program monitoring in the intervention group. And from the baseline data, we know that there were associations, quite strong associations between different indicators of food security and diets and nutrition with screening positive for depression. So we based some of this analysis on these findings. For this analysis, we wanted to use the longitudinal trial data to follow certainly a counterfactual framework. So we're looking at the potential outcomes framework using Medplex in R, and one of my co-authors has developed this method, Stijn van Steelant and his colleagues at both LSHTM and in Belgium, in Ghent, and we used the EPDS, the Edinburgh Postpartum Depression Score, as our endline measure of mental health, which is a screening tool. And then we looked at two sequential mediators, including the household food insecurity access and access scale, and we had 3 different measures in 3 different seasons and 3 different years. And then we also had the Women's Dietary Diversity Score, which we used as a linear measure, and they had 8 measures in both arms of the trial, which was twice per year. So we took the average of those 8 measures and we accounted for the clustered nature of the trial. And even though we had very good balance on baseline in this trial because of the covariate constrained randomization technique that we used, we still adjusted for instance, the baseline depression score of women to reduce any confounding further. So the way that this model works is that we calculate a direct effect from the intervention on the outcome, which is number 1 here. And this is a model showing actually 3 different mediators, just for illustrative purposes. And then you calculate the mediator sequence and block, so all the combined effects of those mediators, and then you basically subtract them one by one to isolate or decompose the effects of each mediator so that you actually have an effect estimate for each component. What we found was that there was in the total trial, there was a reduced odds of depression by about 25% in the intervention group, which means that the people who participated in the Homestead Food Production Program were less likely to screen positive for probable depression at endline. And this, I hope you can read, some of these numbers are rather small, but this is showing the second piece of the analysis, which looks at these different mediating pathways. So we see that there's a direct effect from the intervention on depressive symptoms at endline, and that there is also about 25% of the observed effect is mediated by food security and dietary diversity. So this would be the changes in dietary diversity and food security. But really what we see actually is that there's very little effect from any change in dietary diversity, and most of the effect that we see is coming from the reductions in food insecurity in this population. So that brings us to our conclusions, which is that we are very interested in the fact that a nutrition-sensitive intervention that includes no explicit mental health components can have this effect. And we can see that part of this effect is due to food insecurity, but that also leaves about 75% of the observed effect that is not due to these nutritional or our dietary indicators that we tested. And we have several hypotheses about what might be contributing to these changes. And that could be the group structure of the intervention or improved social support, and possibly changes in women's agency or self-efficacy or other things that we probably haven't actually thought of, and some of them may be explicit and some of them may be much more tacit, but it's very interesting, and this is on the agenda to explore. And then in the wider, bringing these results out into the wider sphere of our work and what this really means, I think one of the interesting things is that so this is one of several analyses that show similar effects and in different contexts. But most people measure mental health as part of nutrition-sensitive programs or work sort of as an afterthought or as a hunch, and they don't really plan out how they can draw strong inferences from the data. They just kind of are curious about the role of mental health. And I think if we measured better and more often in these programs, we would actually find out quite a lot about what is happening for these broader well-being outcomes that we may see. And then if we were to think about it quite explicitly, I feel like we would do better in terms of actually thinking about program design and our efforts to improve both nutrition and food security and mental health by building on those synergies and understanding more of what's going on. Oops. Sorry. So thank you very much. And a special thanks to my co-authors and Stein, who really helped me sort through the idiosyncrasies of the farm data, and all my co-authors from the farm team, and the London School and Amana. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Talia, for presentation. So just to remind the audience, please note down your questions for Talia, and we will come back to them in the question and answer session. So I would like to introduce the second speaker, which is Abdoulaye Bedehombwa. I hope I pronounce it well. He's the representative of Afrique Santé in Burkina Faso, and he will tell us all he knows about Se Lever.
Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure for me to share with you the result of cost evaluation of a multi-sectoral nutrition program implemented through a poultry value chain platform, the Se Lever intervention in Burkina Faso. This study was conducted as part of strengthening economic evaluation for multi-sectoral strategies for nutrition program, which is a result of collaboration between the NGO and institute at the bottom of this slide. With funding support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this project aims first to define most appropriate standardized methods for measuring cost and cost effectiveness of integrated multi-sectoral nutrition strategies and intervention. And second, estimate the cost and benefit as well as cost effectiveness of integrated multi-sectoral approaches to improve nutrition and health outcome. So the SIMS evaluator teams are set about developing a common approach to the conduct of this economic evaluation in nutrition. At the first step of this proposed approach, the evaluator aligned the program under study to a standardized topology and conceptual model of multi-sector nutrition intervention. And at the second step, they describe the impact pathway and identify program benefit activities, input, and cost. This ensures that the relevant information are all able to be captured to decision makers. And third, they adapt the standardized tool to their context and program and then use them to collect cost data alongside impact evaluation. And last, they compare program cost and benefit using various approaches to combine benefits and consider a long-term effect or stronger evidence for nutrition. So this approach was used to conduct cost evaluation of around 8 interventions in 6 countries. My presentation will focus on the result of cost evaluation of Seleve in Burkina Faso. So Seleve was a multi-sectoral interventions designed to increase poultry production and improve the nutritional status of women and children. This in 3 regions in Burkina Faso, and this project was funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for 5 years. And it was implemented by Tananger in partnership with the local NGO. This project had 3 main components. The first one was about poultry production and marketing systems by training and improved poultry practices like vaccination, financing, and housing, as well as activities to strengthen access to poultry production input and credit. The second component was about behavior change communication in nutrition and gender by raising awareness of best practices on diet and gender. And the last component was about behavior change communication in WASH, which used community-led total sanitation, which integrate poultry hygiene management to reduce infant exposure to poultry and livestock feces. So this slide summarizes the Seleve program impact pathway, including activities on the left-hand side, as described above in the previous slide. And so this pathway can be seen as a demand-side pathway at the top of this slide, ending at impact on income, and as a supply-side pathway at the bottom, ending at impact on income. The first one was on nutrition, sorry. So this graphic represents the Seleve cost evaluation pathway at different steps with detail based on the SIMS approach. So at the first step, we designed this study, and second, describe project activities and align them to SIM code. At third, we collect qualitative data to best estimate time allocation and economic cost. And five, we obtain from the implementers financial data and analyze them. And last, we combine financial and economic cost data. For the result, the total incremental cost amounted to $18,084,727, of which 43% of the cost represented the total of financial cost and 57% the total of economic cost. The cost per direct beneficiary amounted to $210, and this graphic represents the breakdown of costs by activity, where the main share of the cost is spent on overhead with 18%, followed by home visit, I think, with 17%. On this slide, we have 2 graphics. The first one represents the breakdown of cost by input, where the big part of the cost goes to the personnel with 51%, followed by other input with 13%. And the other graphics represent the breakdown of costs by pathway, where the main share of the cost goes to the supply with 47%, while demand account for just 31% of the cost. For the sensitivity analysis, has Seleve intervention depended on group participation? We selected parameters that reflected importance of group participation and attendance by group members. So we observed that the cost varied according to the intensity of group participation in the training. For example, the cost per beneficiary ranged from, I think, I don't see well, 200 and $9 for the low intensity to 268 and $86 for the high intensity. On this slide, we have a different intervention that SIMS Consortium conducted economic cost evaluation of. They are all multispectral intervention and also have in common that they included some type of nutrition BCC, but each has different delivery platform. We have microcredit in Bangladesh, poultry production in Burkina Faso, early childhood development for Malawi, and multiple agriculture, health, and nutrition for Nepal. So when we compare the breakdown of costs by pathway between the different interventions we costed, the three other interventions, we take Malawi, Nepal, and Bangladesh, were primarily demand-driven with over 50% of the cost which goes to the demand. But Seleve was, as it was supply-driven, 47% of the cost directed towards supply-side activities. So what can we say about benefits of using a standardized approach? Seleve was slightly more expensive than the other intervention we costed, with 209 per beneficiary, with $209 for Seleve per beneficiary, compared to 157 for Bangladesh and 160 for Malawi. Examining the breakdown of cost by activity, it's notable that nearly a fifth of cost by activity were allocated to overhead and direct. In contrast, the Bangladesh intervention at only 4% of the cost by activity associated with the overhead. And the Seleve intervention was supply-driven, as reflected in the allocation of 47% to supply-side components. We can conclude and say that our results show how standardizing multi-sectoral cost analysis permit comparison with other agriculture nutrition interventions. Thanks. So just to say that for those who want to use this approach, the tools are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. It's really interesting. Now we go to the next speaker. It's a bit of a challenge because this speaker is online.
So then let me start. And apologies for not being able to attend the session in person. As you can see from the slide, I'm presenting also similar to what the colleague just did, a cost-effectiveness analysis of an IFAD-funded project that looked specifically at the nutrition-sensitive agriculture interventions. This project was implemented in Burundi. My name is Enrico Mazzoli. I'm part of a larger group, as you can see, my co-authors, Andrea Fonger, James Garrett, and Salomon Peretz from Bioversity and the Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT. And we performed this study as part of a larger research plan that included another cost-effectiveness analysis in India. So today we just present the findings of this one. I will probably start by giving you a bit the idea of what are the research objectives that we had. So our initial intent was really to try to expand a little bit the knowledge base on this topic, and specifically on the cost effectiveness analysis of these activities that are often neglected in research, or there is very little evidence available. But we also wanted clearly to understand several things. One was to understand whether the investments and activities implemented were having the expected results, were getting the expected results, whether they were working as expected or not. We wanted to understand in case they were working, whether they managed to reach results efficiently from an economic standpoint. But also clearly we wanted to have some operational implication results as well. So trying to understand whether there was scope for upscaling some of these activities in the country or elsewhere. So what were the cost implications of doing that? But also from a research perspective, given that there's no much around about cost effectiveness, and as also the colleague was showing, a method could be used, different methods could be used. We also wanted to, of course, share our vision and lessons that we learned throughout this process with other researchers. And finally, I think most of us have aspire at least to contribute to the policy designs and project designs by informing, the policymakers about their findings and trying to build upon those findings, the new policies. So this is the area where the project was implemented. There is red regions on the map, so mainly in the upper part of Burundi. ProDefi is a second phase of another investment that IFAD started years ago. So this is phase 2. It was it's already over. So the total budget is 52 million, as you can see, and as I said, is an IFAD funded project. We surveyed 16 of the communes in 3 provinces, and mainly we selected randomly 40 households per each sub-area. The sub-area are the collines in the regions. And then alongside that selection, we made a selection for a control group, because our initial intent was clearly to make the usual control versus treatment comparison. But also we had a propensity score matching analysis, because we wanted to understand how different people within ProDefi, so those targeted by the project, were benefited differently from engaging into specific activities, whether they were or not related to nutrition, but then within the different nutrition activities, how they were performing and benefiting from the different activities. And so we ran 8 different scenarios to capture also the average treatment effects. The data collected was on 700 households and 1,700 households, so 1,700 households, and roughly as many women and about 1,000 children. Of course, the focus was mainly on women and children, given also the nature and scope of the activities. And the data was collected in March 2022, so still during COVID somehow. Similar to what the colleague did, I'm also showing the project impact pathways just to describe how we carried out this analysis. Cost effectiveness analysis implies having a big share of the analysis on the cost side, but then of course to understand what was the impact of certain activity, which implies impact evaluation methods. So for example, I'm just showing one of the activity and the different input and processes and results. So for example, the training and the behavioral change strategy adopted by the project was mainly carried out through some training of champions, let's say leaders in community, the Mama Lumieres in this case, and also developing nutrition sensitive approaches and training formats for the community. And that was also obviously made in the hope of having increased adoption of good nutrition practices and hygiene practices, and potentially leading to this improved overall dietary diversity, higher acquisition and adoption of hygienic practices, and improved maternal and nutrition and health for households, women and children. Similarly, the nutrition sensitive activity within ProDefi related to other mass media campaigns like TV, radio events, and dissemination of information on good practices, but also investment for micro projects like small livestock rearing or something like homestay gardening, so food production, and so on and so forth. And each of that different impact pathways leading eventually to increase in income in some cases. So this is where we focused, at least on the left-hand side, you see where we focus our attention for the cost analysis. Through records and other financial records and interviews with the project staff. And there is where you will see instead the efforts made for the impact evaluation to try to understand which activity had an impact. To track the impact, we look at different indicators, food security and nutrition indicators. So at household level, we used 2 indicators, the FIES, so the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, and the Household Data Diversity Score. For nutrition, we looked at the minimum data diversity of women, and similarly we did with children with the minimum data diversity for them, but also added anthropometric indicators in that case. So results. So what did we find is that the project had an impact on these 3 indicators. So the fees was reduced, which is a positive thing. I didn't mention exactly how to read that indicators, but the insecurity experience was reduced. And similarly, there was an increase in the household data diversity score and the minimum data diversity score for women. We could not find any impact for children. There was no statistically significant impact, at least, that we could detect. And this could be for several reasons. One reason could simply be that the project did not have any impact. But most likely, the reason that we found is that nationwide, this Mama Lumia approach is implemented also across the country and not only in the targeted area. So it's very likely that the children not being part of the project are benefiting from similar activities. And so they're moving along with the children targeted by the project. And we feel confident that that could be the reason, because we noticed that there is an increase in the number of children reporting higher scores for the indicators that we considered. So all in all, I think that could be sort of the straw in the wind that indicates the reason why we could not detect any statistically significant result. So I did not mention, but the nutrition sensitive activities within this project amount to 2 million out of the 52 of the overall budget, and roughly the average cost per household or per women, I think, aligned pretty much to what was just shown. In a sense, I think the previous was $2,210, and in this case, I think we have around 163 per women, or a bit more for the households. And so we looked specifically only at the indicators where we had an impact to derive the cost effectiveness, and these are the results. So this is what it will take to spend, of course, to get a change in 1 unit for the score, or 1 percentage point for each. So per percentage point, you see that the range goes from $15 to $38. We ran a sensitivity analysis and a Monte Carlo simulation to account for the certainty that we had on some of the data. You see the graph showing some of the range and the results. And then we also tried to make a comparison with other studies. Of course, comparison with other studies is always limited by many factors. And one could be also the fact that we didn't have many studies reporting on this. And in fact, as you can see, the comparison is just done with 2 studies mainly. But one study was specific on Burundi, the first one, Heckert and all, and the other one was in Bangladesh, actually. I saw Talia already presented one in Bangladesh as well. And so I think that what we could conclude from here is that also our project somehow aligns to the evidence from other study. In some cases performs slightly better, but more or less I think it just falls within the range of reasonable values. So to conclude and go back to the first slide, what did we find is that the solutions adopted by the project were indeed cost effective in improving the data diversity of the target group and reduce the food insecurity, at least for rural households and for women. We didn't detect any impact for children for the reasons we just explained. About the upscaling, you saw the estimates, so the costs, how much would it cost to change the score by 1 unit? And so those could be used as at least an idea when it comes to performing new, preparing and planning for new interventions. But also, I think we wanted to share some lessons on the limits that we found when we performed these analyses. One, of course, the data paucity and the complex dynamics. We had to deal with a country which, of course, is not presents challenges when it comes to implementing surveys, and especially during COVID time. And so we had to face those, and those clearly limited our capacity also to at least to a timely delivery. We were running a bit late. And I think more or less everyone agrees that we need more research in this area. But the real one piece of advice I would like to share with you is that if you want to do similar studies, please try to plan ahead even before starting thinking of the project to implement it. Finally, on the policy dialogue, I think we don't have much more to say because I have never seen, at least in my experience in 12 years, I did never experience, I've never noticed that policy have been driven by research. I hope I'll be proved wrong very soon, but that's not the case yet. We hope that this is going to change. And I'd like to thank, of course, everyone there, but especially HIFED for the financial support that we received and also for the technical support.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Just from the Department of Public Health of Maseno University in Kenya.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here at the conference and to share our work. I think I'm definitely inspired by the conversations that we've already been having, particularly the one on intersectionality yesterday, and thinking about different axes of oppression or of marginalization, and how we can do disaggregated analysis to even question how do for example, different groups of women benefit or not benefit from the interventions we're implementing. So our project looked at a multi-sectoral agricultural intervention in Western Kenya and compared whether widowed women compared to married women, whether they had different or similar outcomes from these interventions, and then trying to theorize or hypothesize why those outcomes could be similar or different. We all know that HIV/AIDS prevalence is highest in Africa globally, and there's also high prevalence of food insecurity in Africa. And we also know that people living with HIV/AIDS experience higher rates of food insecurity with the detrimental effect on their health, both health and social outcomes. So what we may not know too well is the situation of widowed women in Africa. Among women living with HIV/AIDS, you find that widowed women have a higher prevalence as a cohort. And because of social stigmatization of widowhood in the context of Africa, widows face higher risk for HIV/AIDS and also higher risks for poor health outcomes when they're infected. This stigma itself is a fundamental cause for population health inequalities, and for widowed women, stigma is a root cause for economic inequalities, sexual vulnerabilities. So, for example, you find in our context, and I think those of us in Africa know these stories of widows being disinherited from their land, and then property disinheritance increasing, reducing the agricultural productivity, increasing food insecurity, and so the cycle continues. And a number of studies show that comparing widowed women and married women show that widowed women have poorer HIV health outcomes. If you take both groups of women living with HIV, it's lower ART initiation, higher rates of depression, and even higher rates of morbidity. So our question was, given this backdrop that widowed women are quite vulnerable, and those who are HIV/AIDS, would these multi-sectoral agricultural intervention have similar or different outcomes in these two groups of women. So the intervention has been spoken a bit about before, but it included an irrigation pump and a loan, a microfinance loan that the women and the participants in the trial used to acquire a pump and buy also farm inputs, and also structured training on sustainable agriculture and financial literacy. And this intervention was implemented. There we go. The intervention was implemented. So this is the conceptual framework that we used in the program. So the hypothesis was that if you take this multi-sectoral intervention, agricultural intervention, and you implement it among people living with HIV/AIDS in a context where they are receiving routine HIV care and treatment, then the intervention would improve food security through increased production. The focus was on vegetables, so increased production of vegetables, and surplus vegetables can be sold to the market, so the women could have additional money that they could use to buy other types of foods to supplement their diet. And with improved food security and additional income, then we hope there would be improved nutrition, improved ART adherence and retention in care, as well as other outcomes, all of which should lead to improved HIV, reduced morbidity, and hopefully reduced mortality. So that was the conceptual framework that guided the implementation. The study participants were people living with HIV/AIDS, adults aged 18 to 60 years. They needed to have a farmland because this was an agricultural intervention, and also have access to surface water for irrigation. And they needed to be food insecure to be enrolled in the study, which was measured at baseline. The control group did not receive the intervention after the study was completed, and we looked at several outcomes, including food insecurity, HIV/AIDS HIV virus suppression, as well as other HIV-related outcomes such as depression, stigma, and social support. The intervention was implemented over a period of 24 months, and we collected data every 6 months and did multi-level mixed effects model to assess the impact of the intervention. So for the results I'm presenting, it's a sub-analysis comparing only widowed women and married women who were enrolled in the intervention. So for baseline results, as expected, we found that widowed women in the intervention were older than married women, but you can see that their average age for the widowed women was 42 years compared to 30-something years for the married women. Then also in terms of household headship, as expected, majority of the widowed women reported themselves as the household heads, 97% compared to 10% for the married women. Other baseline indicators such as food insecurity, wealth, and also viral load suppression were similar in both groups, but you can notice that viral load suppression was high at baseline, around 82%. But now we look at the outcomes we wanted to assess over a 24-month period. So the orange is the intervention and the blue is the control. When you look at viral load suppression, there wasn't, we did both within group analysis and between group analysis. So if you look at the within group analysis for the widowed and the married women, you'll see for the viral load suppression, there wasn't difference. There was no difference between intervention and control, and also between the two groups. But then for other outcomes such as depression and stigma, internalized and anticipated stigma, we saw greater reductions of those outcomes for both widowed and married women comparing intervention and control, but no difference between the groups in terms of whether reductions greater for one group or the other. Those were similar. But then there were two outcomes that we saw difference between widowed women and married women. One of those was social support, where if you can trace those lines for social support, you find that married women had a greater reduction greater improvement in their social support, which was measured by higher scores in social support meant higher scores meant lower social support. So when you have lower scores, it means you are having more social support. This similarly for enacted stigma, married women had better outcomes after 24 months compared to widowed women. You can see that they started with the highest enacted stigma scores. Higher scores means higher enacted stigma, and they ended up with the lowest scores. So what we are learning from these results is that for certain outcomes that we thought of as individual level outcomes, such as depression, food security, internalized and anticipated stigma, for those outcomes, both widowed women and married women fared. They benefited similarly. And we think that for widowed women, given that the vulnerability they're starting with, this could be as a result of their agency. So there's a literature out here showing that widowed women, being the household heads, having higher having more decision-making power, they have more control over what crops they're planting and how they're utilizing the income from those crops. But for some other outcomes, such as enacted stigma and social support that are socially dependent, that depending on the external environment, widowed women had poorer outcomes compared to married women. And we think that we need to do more research to understand the larger societal context, especially stigma, and the widowed women could be experiencing more intersectional stigma that we need to understand further. So I would like to just thank the bursary from ANH to be able to present here, and my co-authors, some of whom are in the audience, and also the funders that have made both the research and my training possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Let's turn to Charlotte. Charlotte Lane is the Senior Evaluation Specialist of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or E3IE. She's based in Baltimore, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Okay, so I'm presenting our work on the long-term effects of food systems interventions and specifically agricultural interventions. And I'm presenting this on behalf of Pierre, who is one of my great co-authors on this. So just to frame this issue a bit, we've been talking about food systems transformation and about needing sustainable change, but we don't measure sustainable change. We measure outcomes along that program cycle. So program cycle is about 3 to 5 years, and we're lucky if we measure outcomes if we're being with ourselves. 2.3 years of when the intervention started. So there was a joke earlier today about what doesn't get measured gets modeled, but we can't be modeling long-term change based off of short-term change. We know that these are fundamentally different. So in some cases like BCC or knowledge transfer, you might get that short-term change, but it fades off pretty quickly over time. On the reverse side, if you're thinking about something that requires social change and societal change, you might not achieve that in 2 years, but you might achieve it in 10 years. So we can't just be taking these short-term changes and assuming that those equal long-term changes. So what we wanted to do was, first of all, just figure out how often we are measuring long-term change and then look into what that change was. Okay, so we did this relying on the universe of studies within 3IE's Food Systems and Nutrition Evidence Gap Map. At the time that we started this, that had about 2,000 articles in it. And we started just by going through all of those studies and recording the time between when the intervention started and when the last outcome measurement took place. And what you can see here is that half of all studies in that evidence gap map measured outcomes within a year of the intervention starting. So then you can see sort of going down that it gets less and less common to measure outcomes further down. And we found 78 studies that measured outcomes 10 years or more after an intervention started. And that's what we defined as long-term. Yes, it is sort of arbitrary, but we had to choose something. That 78 number is very small, but it's also bigger than we bargained for. So we weren't able to do the synthesis on all of them. So we chose the 19 studies that looked at agricultural interventions and measured outcomes related to income, crop production, climate, or the environment. So there were 19 studies of 25 agricultural interventions, and that's what we were able to do our additional deep dive analysis on. And so we call this a rapid evidence assessment because we accelerated that search and screening process by relying on the EGM. But once we did that, we transitioned into the traditional process for a systematic review. So we did our data extraction of our effect sizes in duplicate. We then converted those to standardized mean differences. We did our inverse variance weighting meta-analysis. So that's kind of the traditional approach that a systematic review would take. And before I get into those results, I do want to give a little bit more context on the papers that are underlying that rapid evidence assessment. So like I said, there's 25 interventions. A lot of them were related to agricultural education. We also had studies that looked at soil and water conservation, as well as the provision of agricultural inputs. Those were often seeds and fertilizers. Most of these studies took place in sub-Saharan Africa, with Latin America and the Caribbean being the next most studied region. One thing that we have to be careful about here is just the incredible variation in these 19 studies, right? So it's not totally fair to just dump these all into a meta-analysis. That doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense given the variation in the type of interventions and also the local context of these interventions. So we have that as context to help us quant people wrap our minds around this, but we also wanted to dive into the stories that were coming out of each of these studies to look at causal mechanisms, especially over that longer time period. We do have to also be careful with this work because there was a pretty high risk of bias in this data set. So as part of a traditional systematic review, we do a risk of bias assessment. There were 56 effect estimates in this analysis, and only 7 of them were rated as having a low risk of bias. The dominant reasons for risk of bias were related to confounding and outcome measurement. Most of these evaluations were post hoc evaluations. They weren't planned from the beginning. Those can be great studies, but they're harder to do without introducing bias. And then also these all relied on self-reported outcome measurements. Again, there are ways to do that without introducing bias, but there is a higher likelihood that this can sort of go awry and you can end up with high risk of bias estimates. So with that context, this is the actual analysis that we have looking at the standardized mean difference effect estimates of the available interventions and looking at crop production. So you can see that they're pretty tightly clustered around a null effect, but we do have some negative effects as well as some positive effects over the long term. And if you sort of look at those 2 negative effect ones, what's interesting is those are the 2 that we have that are about fair trade and organic certification programs. So that just raises a question about, okay, over the long term, fair trade and organic certification programs are reducing agricultural productivity. When we go into these papers and we ask why that's happening, that those authors hypothesize, they're basically saying that working closely with local farmers, making sure that the educational approach is tailored to those local realities, and making sure that there's some sort of sustained engagement and trust building might have been why these programs succeeded in the long term. Switching over to our income analysis, these all had null effects, which is a little bit depressing, but that in and of itself is an important finding, right? So over the long term, these agricultural interventions are not affecting income. We did find, looking at the forest, soil, and water conservation programs, when you pool those effects, they do become statistically significant, but that's based off of null individual effect estimates, so that's not super convincing of a finding. And then getting to our last outcome, looking at climate and the environment, there were no studies that looked at the long-term effects of agricultural interventions on climate outcomes. People are often surprised by this because we know so much about the link between agriculture and climate. But what we don't know is what are our interventions in the agricultural sector actually doing on climate outcomes. So that's something that we need to be measuring in general. And obviously, we're in it for the long haul, so we need to be measuring those long-term outcomes. So just wrapping up the implications of this, First and foremost, I just think it's interesting to know what's out there. We have those 78 studies, and that's more than I think any of us was actually expecting, which is exciting. We don't normally get these types of positive answers to those questions. We are not able to reach generalized conclusions about what these types of interventions are going to be doing in the long term just because of that incredible variation. And just to give one example of that, we had 2 studies looking at the effects of land titling programs. They were very similar programs. One took place in Ethiopia and one took place in India. The one in India had null effects and might have actually increased inequality. And the reason that was given for that was that land titling in that context sort of further marginalized low caste individuals because they were not getting access to formal land titles. So now they formally did not have access to land. In contrast, in Ethiopia, where the government was the dominant driver of land insecurity, having that formal guarantee from the government that you would maintain access to land seemed to increase investment in land as well as productivity in the long term. So just thinking again about when we're doing meta-analysis and systematic reviews versus looking into those stories in detail. And then wrapping up, I also think that we as researchers and research commissioners need to think about the incentive structure for these long-term evaluations. So the reason that we're not doing this is because the things that we are doing now is fundamentally different than the things that we did 10 years ago. So it's not necessarily, it's hard to be evaluating things as our priorities change over time, but also we need to be making sure that we take that long-term and consistent approach to food systems transformation, because that's how we're going to get there.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. Then we go to Edward Joy. He's an assistant professor also in the nutrition group of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you today about a trial that went wrong. And it was the Addressing Hidden Hunger with Agronomy trial in Ethiopia. So I'm going to talk about how it failed, why it failed, and what we've learned from that. But perhaps first just to say that this was one of 2 sister trials. There was an Addressing Hidden Hunger with Agronomy trial in Malawi as well. And these 2 trials formed one of the work packages in the Geonutrition project, which was funded by the Gates Foundation. I will say that the rest of the Geonutrition project has gone really well. So we had lots of successes in the project. Just to give you a brief background to the AHA Ethiopia trial. So our hypothesis was that we could improve micronutrient status in a rural Ethiopian population through consumption of teff flour that's been biofortified with selenium and zinc fertilizers. So we undertook the biofortification in preparation for the trial, and this worked. We increased the zinc and selenium concentration of teff. And the question for us in this trial was, if that's consumed, does it improve the status of the participant? In terms of design, we designed a pragmatic double-blind randomized control trial. We selected a community setting in Amhara region, not far from Bahida. We aimed to recruit 140 adult women and 140 children, school-aged children, to randomize them in a 1-to-1 ratio between the control and the intervention. And the trial protocol, if you're interested, you can find it was prospectively registered. In terms of the intervention itself, we plan to give 60 days of the teff flour at the equivalent of 250 grams per person per day, which we thought would be sufficient to meet requirements. We gave enough flour to meet the requirements of all household members because households tend to eat together. Non-participant households in the same villages as the participant households were provided with free control equivalent flour, and this was to reduce the likelihood that households would share the flour that they received and therefore not have enough for themselves. About a year before we planned the intervention, we conducted formative field work, focus group discussions, interviews, etc., key informant interviews. We did this well in advance of the study so that we had time to use the findings from this to inform the intervention itself and its delivery. We also, in these groups and these interviews, we asked people about potential fears and concerns they might have about participating in the trial. Would they be willing to do it? What factors would they want to know? What questions do they have? And this was vital in informing our community sensitization work that followed from that. We've produced the TEF, working with a local farmer cooperative, and we decided to do this because we wanted to show that we wanted people to be able to see where the TEF had come from, to increase their confidence that this was grown in a very kind of normal manner. They could see the crop, they could see it being harvested, they knew the people involved in that. The community sensitization work began quite soon after the formative field work. So we had a long period running up to the start of the intervention. It took various different shapes and guises, but we had large community meetings with all the villages that were going to be participating in the trial. We had smaller meetings with senior members of the community, and these included local government members and also members. I should say that all of this work was led by colleagues and collaborators at Addis Ababa University in a team led by Dr. Daud Gashu. So far, so good. And in fact, recruitment went really well as well. We recruited 143 households, each household contributing one adult woman and one adult child. And now we'll follow the consort flow diagram of what happened next. So recruitment went well, followed by randomization. And now we come into the intervention itself. And we see the first signs of problems here. At the first round of flour distribution, and we were taking flour right to the households, or to sites within very easy reach of the households. We found that about close to 40 of the households did not come forward to collect the flour. In the second round of flour distribution, things got even worse. And almost no households came forward to collect the flour as part of this trial. And so we paused. At that point, we stopped the trial. At this point, we stopped the trial in consultation with the Independent Trial Steering Committee. We had, obviously, many members of the field team in the field at the time, so we were getting a good sense of what was going wrong. But we were going around asking people, are you still willing to participate? They would say yes, and then would not come forward to collect the flour. We were trying to find out why. But I should say at this point, we were working during the middle of the COVID pandemic, and that conflict very close to the region was starting to break out, and it made it very hard for the field teams to be present in the field, certainly for long periods of time. So the team were going in and out of the community when access was permitted. We never planned to do a process evaluation, but after we ended the trial formally, we decided to do a process evaluation. This was difficult to do because by this point, due to the conflict, we were not able to access the community at all, certainly for long periods of time. As I said, we didn't plan to do a process evaluation, but we thought it was important to do. We relied primarily on feedback from field team members, what they learned when they had been present in the field, on notes we made during the community sensitization, and continued as we saw the intervention started. So for short periods of time to the community as well to conduct some in-depth interviews with participants and also with some of the influential community members in the church and in the local government as well. The first thing that we drew from this process evaluation was, as I mentioned, that context was a massive factor here, and the COVID pandemic and also the regional conflict. And this had various pathways in terms of its effect on the intervention. To give you an example, we weren't able to respond quickly when we found that things were going wrong. We were not able to convene people together in community sensitization events because there are limits on the number of people in gatherings. We were very concerned about taking COVID from Addis Ababa into the rural community where there was zero vaccination available, potentially vulnerable populations. Regional conflict, again, roads were closed, there were demonstrations, people who've been working with in local government were suddenly not present anymore. There was a lot of politics that I never got to the bottom of in terms of relationships between local and regional government. And I guess finally the point where we really realized that this trial was over was when the grain that we had produced for the trial was requisitioned by the local government to give to internally displaced people who've been displaced by the conflict. What we observed, what we found was that there were negative rumors spreading about the trial. There were fears, there were suspicions. We did know that this would be likely to occur from the formative fieldwork. We thought we'd addressed it with the community sensitization in advance of the trial. We obviously hadn't totally. We struggled to access the community to address these in a timely manner. And we found that these fears and suspicions were spreading faster than we could address through the sensitization. But we really tried to get to the bottom of what these fears and suspicions were. It wasn't, for the large part, fears with actually consuming the flower. That was not the problem. What we found was that there was stigma attached to participating in the trial. So had we been distributing something totally different, had the intervention looked totally different, we may still have had the same problem. People were worried about the social stigma attached to participating in the trial and what all the connotations that brought along. Participants were not collecting the flower because they feared being excluded from community events, particularly from church events. And people who had received the flower were then asked not to come to church. They were excluded and they faced social stigma. We had to pause and then close the trial very quickly because of this, because of the real problem of potential participant harms that came about from this. Conflicting roles of different community stakeholders. I'm not going to go into this in any depth, partly because we never got to the bottom of this, but we found that there were members of the community, influential members of the community, who remained totally supportive of the trial, including those in the regional church positions of authority. There were other members of the community who were not in support of the trial. Again, this included some members of the local church community as well. So we found that all the people we had engaged with through the community sensitization, some of them decided that this trial was good for the community and good for them to support, and others took a different view. Turning to the process evaluation and lessons for the future, I think if we were to do this again, we would do some things differently with the benefit of hindsight and with the benefit of the process evaluation. One is I think we would plan for more in the way of trust building activities. And I don't know exactly what shape those would take. We would need to plan those and co-develop those with the community. But I think something we would certainly look to do is pilot the intervention as part of the trust building activity. And we could, for example, have undertaken a month where we distributed the flower in a manner that looked very much like the intervention, to give us time again to identify potential concerns and respond to those. This obviously needs planning well in advance because you need to grow the TEF crop or whatever crop. So you need to be planning this month at least a year in advance so you can grow sufficient material for this. It will cost money, it will cost field staff time, etc. But I think it would have de-risked it to an extent. We could have included adult men in the trial. There were several reasons we didn't do this. We thought that if we learned from the effects on adult women and children, that we could be quite confident that this would work for other demographic groups as well. We were trying to minimize participant burden and costs associated with the trial. But this was one of the issues that did come up in the process evaluation. People were saying, well, you excluded men. Were you trying to make our women infertile? Were you trying to prevent the growth of our children, etc.? We could have mimicked existing programs and intervention delivery structures. But I think the biggest learning we found, and this is where we were able to compare between our experiences in the AHA Ethiopia and AHA Malawi trial, was about ethics and community participation. Now, going into this study, I viewed ethics as something that you had to clear before you were able to get on with the work. I'll be totally honest with that. I viewed it as something that you'd think about carefully, but once you've done your ethics application, got approval, then you can go ahead. The other view of ethics I had was that if problems arose, you just try and address them as they came along and do your best to keep on top of them. My view of that has changed, and that's changed from our experiences with the AHA Malawi trial and some work that was led by Nimbanazo Matandika and Professor Joseph Mutsubengo at College of Medicine, now Kuhez in Malawi, and Professor Kate Miller. So they pioneered something called a real-time ethics approach, which is an ongoing, continuous, responsive way of conducting ethical oversight and response during community-based trials. I'll wrap up very quickly now. So this real-time ethics approach creates a space for dialogue between participants and the researchers on social and ethical issues. You take time to understand participants' experiences through the duration of the trial, and you respond through discussion and changing modes of delivery. And through the process, you build mutual trust and ownership. And just to give you an idea of what this real-time ethics approach found in Malawi, at the start, similar problems that we found in Ethiopia. Participants were worried about ridicule for participation, about blood sucking, and worried about providing blood samples. But during the trial, partly through the responsiveness of the real-time ethics approach, by the end, we were getting quotes like this. This is why we became strong-willed in terms of their participation. So we should see the end. We're not going back, we volunteered. So for me, the biggest learning is about embedding a continuous ethics approach in these community-based trials. And that's where we'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. And thank you also for the courage to present research that did not go well. We don't hear that very often, but it's important to learn a lot of things from that. So we had a nice portfolio of different nutrition-sensitive interventions, 4 of them related to health outcomes and related to costing. We had a meta-analysis of lasting effects of nutrition-sensitive or food system interventions. And then Edward presented us something that went wrong, but from which we could learn a lot. So I think we have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank the speakers, presenters of today, this afternoon, for their excellent presentations. And I also would like to thank you here in the room as well as online for attending the presentations and having nice questions and discussion points to increase understanding of the different projects. So thanks a lot. I think time has come for another coffee or tea break in the room besides here. And then the program will continue today. Thank you very much.